Let's recap Words of Radiance, Interludes 1, 2, 3, and 4. We learn from Eshonai that the Parshendi home, or the listeners as they call themselves, is called Narok or Exile, and it's in the Central Plain. They also are surrounded by ruins, like the Shattered Plains in general. And Eshonai mentions how the Alethi don't even realize that they're walking on the remnants of ancient civilizations. They think they're just seeing, natural formations when they're really not. Eshonai speaks of 5 forms that the listeners have. We have war form, which is the form that we see on the plateau assault runs. They have nimble form, work form, mate form, self explanatory, and also dull form, which is basically what parshmen are. Songs that her people have passed down for hundreds of years speak of there being hundreds of forms that they used to be able to take on, but these have been lost. And so Eshonai's sister, Venli, is a scholar, and she's been searching for new forms for her people to use to help them, either with diplomacy or with this war. And Venli, when speaking to Eshonai, she asks her, if you got to speak to Dalinar, which Eshonai's trying to do, what would you say? And Eshonai says she would sue for peace. Now, it becomes very clear that Venli and many others don't think that this is a realistic thing to do. And we see that further when Venli reveals that she has discovered a new form, but it's called Stormform, and it is clearly one that's for destruction and death. And Eshonai is very skeptical of using this because she says that's a form of their old gods and they seem to be fearful of them. She says, they escaped their gods and humans many years ago, but Venli is saying, the humans have surge binders now, and do you really think they're going to let it go that we killed their king? So she kind of, makes her case that the listeners need to be able to defend themselves and fight. And so Eshonai agrees to consider using Stormform. The second interlude is the POV of an older man named Yim. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But he is a shoemaker, but apparently more than that, because a spren talks to him and says he comes, and then a moment later, an urchin off the street, a little boy, comes into the shop, and Yim ends up sizing him up for some free shoes. Apparently, he does that. He gives the needy, free shoes in exchange for their stories. And so he's giving this urchin shoes, and in the process, he ends up healing him like sneakily. Like he puts a salve on the underside of his foot, but really he's reaching into his desk and grabbing spears and using them to heal. So he is apparently a surge binder. When the boy leaves with his new shoes, the spren says he's still here. And then this man appears, this Makabaki man with a shard blade. And Yim is saying, like, I didn't know. And it turns out basically he was involved in some assassination attempt involving poison wine and 40 years ago killed someone. And he's like, it was so long ago. And this man basically says, like, it's never too late for justice. Down comes the shard blade, and there ends Yim's story just like that. In the third interlude, we revisit Rysn, and her master at this point is apparently sick, and they're on their way to do a trade at the Reshi Islands. Now, it turns out that the islands, which apparently go to war with each other, quite literally, because instead of being actual islands, they are giant great shells, which is just amazing. And her master is telling her, we need to do this trade. This is very important. But these people value boldness and strength. They will not trade with a sick man. So she needs to go in his stead. And so she does. She makes it up this, Great Shell Island. And she's trying to do this trade in his stead. And she's speaking to this king, and they're not they're not entertaining it. They're like, come back to us when we've earned, a respect for you in your own right. Take a couple years. And she keeps fighting back. She's like, no, we need this trade, blah blah blah. She's like, if you trust him and he trusts me, then that should be enough. And so the king does say that her efforts are valiant, and he respects that, but still no trade's going to happen. So she ends up thinking, hey, they respect boldness, right? So she thinks, who has more authority than the king? How about the gods? And so she grabs a rope and flings herself off the side of the mountain. Everybody's freaking out. And she goes to speak to one of these gods, aka the Great Shell. And she goes down to where its giant eyeball is, and she's like, oh, great god, am I worthy of this trade? And then her rope snaps. She ends up falling down very far into water, which we all know is basically like jumping straight down onto concrete. So it doesn't end well for her. She survives, but she does shatter both of her legs. The consolation prize, though, is that they did get what they were going there for, and it turns out to be this rare creature with wings that kind of sounds like a dragon. Um, and they're apparently a creature that not many people know still exists today. This creature is called a larkin, and it has solid silver eyes, and we just get the feeling this is important. This book is friggin' heavy. So interlude 4, we go back to Eshonai and we learn from her that the way the listeners transform is by stepping into high storms. And usually they're supposed to sing the songs that correspond to the form they're trying to turn into. But they kind of have a hack where if they go in with a trapped spren, it can help guide their transformation. So her sister Venli is working on trapping enough of these storm spren, which turn out to be the red lightning spren that Syl warned Kaladin about. So, that doesn't bode well. Eshonai goes to speak to her mother, and this is kind of sad. Well, it is sad because she basically has like dementia, but Eshonai does get her to tell her again the story of the dark home, and it turns out to be the backstory of her people. And we learn that they used to be called the Last Legion, and in the past, her people would fight on behalf of their god. And it sounds like they would be given forms of extreme power, but also extreme obedience, and they would go and create destruction. So this does line up with Yasna's theory that the Parshmen or Parshendi are the voidbringers. But from Eshonai's POV, what we're hearing, it sounds like they weren't really, volunteering to be these beings of destruction. They were forced into it. So we also learn at the end of this story that on the day of this great storm, the last legion fled from their god. And by doing that, they gave up this form of power for freedom. But what they lost was their free will, aka becoming the parchment. The interlude ends with us seeing the Council of Five talk about the merits of using this Stormform, and they do end up agreeing with the caveat that Eshonai, not Venli, will take on this form. Venli is not happy about this. She thinks Eshonai is stealing her glory, but Eshonai tries to tell her, you're too close to this, and you're, not as expendable, because Venli's the one who is researching these forms. She's got the brains. So that is the agreement that with the next high storm, Eshonai is going to do this transformation and report back to her people. And now we move on to part 2.